Well, that's very important.
And so I specifically love some of your terms like dictatorship of cousins or something like that.
Right.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, we are back with our series of conversations and interviews with intellectuals in Ukraine. For those out there who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. This is the already episode 24. І ми повертаємося з нашою серією розмов та інтерв'ю з інтелектуалами в Україні для тих, хто хоче дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути з перших джерел. В етері 24-й випуск. This is a project of PEN Ukraine, whose entire team is in Ukraine right now, continuing their work under the extremely difficult conditions of terror and the violence of Russia's continuing war against Ukraine. There are no words enough to express our admiration of their dedication and commitment. Це проєкт PEN Україна, вся команда якого зараз перебуває в Україні, продовжуючи свою роботу в надзвичайно складних умовах терору та насильства війни Росії проти України. Немає достатньо слів, аби висловити наше захоплення вашою відданістю та наполегливістю. The project is co-hosted by PEN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. The project is implemented with the support of the US Embassy in Ukraine and our traditional partners are PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Harvard University Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We are streaming today's event to all their Facebook pages. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тих, хто зараз перебуває в групі найвищого ризику. Проєкт втілюється за підтримки Посольства З'єднаних Штатів Америки в Україні, і нашими традиційними партнерами є ПЕН Америка, Український інститут Лондона, Україна Світ, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на усі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. І захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. And I switch to English to introduce our guests. From Ukrainian side, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Valerii Pekar, who is entrepreneur since 1992, lecturer at Kyiv-Mohyla Business School, School of Public Management and Business School of the Ukrainian Catholic University, and also Open University of Maidan and Ukrainian Leadership Academy. He's the author of a best-selling book on management and second place winner of the National Book Competition in Personal Development. He's also co-founder of the New Country Civic Platform, member of the National Reform Council, and advisor of 2 ministers of economy. So he has certain experience not only in business, but in state and society changes. And Mr. Valerii will hold the dialogue with a person who barely needs the introduction, at least for those who had philosophy or political studies courses in university, like myself. Professor Francis Fukuyama is one of probably the most famous political scientists in the world and author notably The End of History and the Last Man and Trust, Social Virtues and Creation of Prosperity. Now, in his new book, Liberalism at its Disconnect, he offers liberalism as a solution to our current problems of social bifurcation, if paired with the other functional institution of a democracy. I hope we will find a way to talk about it today as well somehow. But back to Ukraine. In your last article, one of the last articles, dear Professor Fukuyama, in American Purpose, Preparing for Defeat, you said that diplomacy is not the way to resolve the situation in current case. And the main risk for Putin will definitely not come from his society. And probably here where the difference lays. I remember once you mentioned that Ukrainian Orange Revolution was a big surprise for you in terms of Ukrainian civil society and development and spirit. And previously you had some hopes that something like that was possible in Russia. But now we can probably see how big maybe even mistake that was later you even called the revolution of dignity kind of a miracle. And now in your Twitter, you say Ukraine can win, no deal until it does. I think this is a position shared by all the Ukrainians all around the world. The only question is of the price of this win. So sitting here with two future-looking experts in society changes, let's start the perception of the war by international audiences, try to reflect on the evolution of this perception since February 24th, transformations of Ukrainian civil society, and how to deal with the shadow of the empire. Those and other future-looking questions today in the conversation of Valerii Pekar and Professor Francis Fukuyama. Dear gentlemen, floor is yours. Thank you. Professor?
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. I must say that I and almost everybody, in the United States feels a great deal of awe and respect for the resistance, the heroic resistance that Ukraine has put up against this Russian aggression. And I personally have been trying to do, whatever I can to support Ukraine, as have many of my colleagues at Stanford and more broadly in the United States. I think that the surprise that you refer to reflects two things. Early on in the war, we overestimated Russian power and we greatly underestimated Ukrainian resolve and unity. And those have come together in a very surprising but also hopeful way, to this fierce resistance. I do want to talk about, the future of American and European support for Ukraine, but I think before we get into that, I'd like to ask Valerii some questions about the current situation. I've known Valerii because he participated in a leadership academy training that we did in Ukraine a few years ago. So Valerii, perhaps you could tell us about the general situation and perceptions from the Ukrainian side about how the war is going, and then obviously you could focus on some of the economic consequences and how you see Ukraine's future in that regard.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, I would like to say that we in Ukraine extremely appreciate support from American people and American government in this war. A friend is in need is a friend indeed, and we know now that Ukrainian people, all Ukrainian people appreciate that fantastic support that American people and American government provides to Ukrainian army and to Ukrainian nation in this war. Thank you very much. And I would like also to appreciate all world American intellectuals which support Ukraine by their efforts to explore the situation, to understand what is being held, because all pre-war worldviews practically disappeared. We know that so many things which we believed in before are now not so relevant. So, what is being held in Ukraine now, from a pure military point of view, we now have something like third stage of the war. The first one was a rapid maneuver war to catch Ukrainian cities and let Ukrainian government to surrender. It was impossible, it fails. Then Russian forces turned into second stage, scorched earth strategy used already in Syria, in Chechnya, to make as much possible damage as much damage as possible to Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, to convince Ukrainian leadership to surrender. This also failed, and now there is a third phase of the war, which is a pure positional war, much more similar to Second World War, since Russian forces have no resources to wage this war on the long theater, on the long front line. They shrank the front line to one let's say, small territory which is equal in size to the Kiev city in eastern Ukraine and try to make damage to Ukrainian army there. Indeed, every day many best men and women on Ukrainian side die, but really from strategic point of view, that means nothing. So they can do nothing. And we have a very interesting point in this war when Ukraine can win, as you were absolutely you were also right. Ukraine can win, but Russia has already lost. So indeed, the end of the war could be total loss for everybody. For instance, if Russian leadership will use nuclear weapons, but there is no one scenario when Russia wins this war. Russia has already lost, and maybe we should explore how it is possible and why. And I think that this is a fact which everybody should accept, that Russia has already lost. And now what we need to end this war to make Ukraine a winner. And indeed, a very important point is to ensure European and global security, to ensure that next war will not come to Europe anymore. From economic point of view, we have a giant decline. Practically one half of Ukrainian economics has stopped, and now we see certain revival in territories which are free, like Kyiv and surrounding. Small and medium-sized business, and it is more flexible and tries to relaunch, or to sometimes with relocation to other more safe locations in Western Ukraine. But indeed, the whole territory of Ukraine is under attack, under missile attack, and some 20% of Ukrainian territory is still occupied by Russian forces.
So maybe you could say something about the situation in the Black Sea, because that's an area that has now finally been getting some more attention. As everyone knows, Ukraine is a really major agricultural exporter. You've basically got a whole year's worth of grain that is just sitting in silos because of the Russian blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. There's been increasing attention paid to this. There was just a delegation of African leaders that went to talk to Putin about opening up some of those ports because in addition to cutting off a major source of export earnings for Ukraine, this is causing a major food crisis in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, and many other parts of the world. What is the situation there, and do you see any prospects for progress in this respect?
Indeed, sea blockade is one of the major weapons of Putin as far as two major sectors of Ukrainian export, agriculture and metallurgy, go by the sea. And indeed, there will be no world crisis in terms of metal, but there will be indeed there is a threat of crisis in terms of food. By the way, it is surprising that some countries which could be damaged by this food crisis, they are continuing continue voting for Russia at different United Nations arenas. And in this is a threat not only to Middle East, but also to Europe, because a huge food crisis in the Middle East and in Africa will create a new refugee crisis in Europe and will undermine European unity and European strength. So this is a world problem, not only African and Middle East problem. So what to do? There are several things to do. First of all, Ukraine could not remove this blockade by itself, because Ukraine practically has very, very small fleet. Indeed, the world knows about Ukrainian success and victories on the sea, like so several major Russian battleships and other ships already sunk, but this is a result of Ukrainian missile attacks. I think everybody knows now that Ukraine is one of the major developers of missiles in the world, as it is proved on the battlefield, not only by statements of Ukrainian leaders, but it's proved on the battlefield. But indeed, to remove blockade, it is necessary to have a fleet. And here we need a huge international coalition to remove blockade and to provide food for Middle East and Africa countries. Who will do this? Either the European Union, or it will be China as a global responsible leader caring about Africa, or it will be maybe a Turkish initiative. As far as we see now, Turkey has a very ambivalent position, and practically Turkey is blocking now international efforts to remove blockade. So I think this is a field, there is a room for certain world leadership to organize this international coalition to remove blockade. Indeed, Russian forces will shell Ukrainian ships and maybe NATO ships, but there are many countries in the world which will never be shelled by Russian forces, like Chinese fleet, for instance. So who is a responsible leader to provide food to the Middle East and Africa? This is still an open question. Professor?
I think that this is a really complicated diplomatic effort. I think that, you could imagine a UN effort to actually open up the Black Sea because of the food crisis. You're really talking about protecting innocent passage of commercial ships in international waters, because once you get outside of Ukrainian territorial waters, these are international waters. And it seems to me that Turkey really should have an interest in being seen as a leader in trying to resolve this food crisis, not necessarily because it sided with Ukraine over Russia in the war, but simply because this is a global interest that could be served by it. And so I'm not quite sure why this effort hasn't been more successful. I think that the United States at some point had some worries about, escalation, that if NATO were seen as trying to break this blockade, that this might lead to escalation. But I think that this is an overstated fear. I think in general, although we do have to worry about Russian escalation, especially to the use of nuclear weapons, that by and large, this is not something that is very likely to happen. I think that if the Russians were to escalate, for example, try to sink commercial shipping coming out of Ukraine, or attacking, boats escorting this kind of shipping, it would look very bad for them politically. They would lose a lot of support. I guess the one thing that I worry about is whether the narrative might change. At this point, I think people tend to blame Russia for the food crisis more than Ukraine. But if the war bogs down and there are increasing calls for a negotiated settlement, that narrative may change, and people will start blaming Ukraine, saying they need to settle, they need to make territorial concessions in order to end the war, and then to open up the possibility of exporting food. I don't know how you see that, but I do think that it's something that is very important to control the narrative, to make sure that the blame for this crisis lies on the party that's really responsible, and that is Russia and not Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, I would like to say that indeed, this is not pure a NATO task to remove the blockade, and I understand NATO leaders which are afraid of escalation from Russian side. Also, I would like to add one point: the mining of the Black Sea is a huge problem for civil and commercial ships. And this is also a big task for international community. So now this is a room for responsible leadership, not only for NATO countries, for all countries. I would like to pay attention to your question concerning nuclears. So there are two different views in the West and in Ukraine concerning possibility of nuclear attack. Many Western observers think that the Putin will use a nuclear weapon when he feels weak and when he feels like a rat in a corner. This isn't, so this will be his, let's say, ultimate weapon. This isn't true. We in Ukraine believe in practically opposite. We know Russia and Russian leadership quite well. We understand that Putin will use nuclear weapon from the point of strength, not weakness. If he feel that he is strong, if he feels that there will be no response, that there will be just many diplomatic talks and no response for nuclear attack, and if he feels that his surrounding Russian elites supports him and are consolidated around him, in this case, he will do this. So since Putin isn't so strong now, and we see a lot of controversies among Russian elites, we see that nuclear threat is not so big. And this will be, he will never use nuclear force weapon feeling himself weak and elites not consolidated around him. And also, I would like to comment a narrative about keeping faith. Putin controls all media in his country. Putin controls everything, and people in his country used to believe to Russian propaganda, whatever they see. They lost critical thinking at all, and in their brain, two different statements, two opposite statements could coexist. Like they believe that Ukrainians and Russians are the same nation, but they believe the Ukrainians always hate Russians. Or they believe that Ukrainian and Russians are the same nation, and Ukrainian in their bioweapon laboratories invent weapons which target only Russians, but they are the same nations. So this is a loss of critical thinking. I can say that George Orwell wrote Anti-Utopia, but he didn't expect that someone will take this book and use it as a manual, as a guideline. So it was really so. And you're absolutely right, Professor, saying that we should control a narrative concerning food crisis and who is guilty. But speaking about concessions, we should take into account several points. First, Ukraine is rather big in European scale, and when we're speaking about occupied territories, this is something like a big part of Germany, or half of Italy, or the whole Hungary with some adjacent territories. So this is quite a big territory, and millions are living there. We could speak about concessions if we could imagine that Russian forces will behave according to the rules of war. But what we see is absolutely opposite. We see a whole range of all war crimes, including murder, rape, looting, kidnapping, forcible removal of people to Siberia, concentration camps in the worst Nazi style. And when we are speaking about concessions of territories, we simply are losing the fact that we should speak about millions of people which will suffer and die. So what is better to let some people suffer from famine in Africa, or to let some people in Ukraine to suffer from murder and rape? This is a very hard question, and nobody can say that one option is better than another. So we have only one option. We have an option to deblocate Black Sea and to remove the threat of the crisis.
Yeah, so I agree with you on the escalation fears. I don't think that anyone should not worry about escalation. This conflict is different from really all of the prior post-Cold War conflicts in that it does involve a country that has a very, very large nuclear arsenal. And so I don't think we should simply discount that. But I do think that if you look at the operational consequences of the Russians actually using a nuclear weapon, it doesn't buy them that much military advantage, and it will trigger almost certainly a NATO response. NATO does not have to reply symmetrically. You know, if the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon, NATO does not have to also use a tactical nuclear weapon. There are many conventional responses. So, for example, NATO has been reluctant to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, you know, precisely for fear of this kind of escalation. But if the escalation happens, then a no-fly zone with direct NATO involvement, you know, attacking Russian aircraft and air defense systems, I think is on the table. And I think as the Russians make these calculations, they'll see that they actually don't buy themselves any particular advantage by moving to this kind of escalation. And then furthermore, we just haven't seen any intelligence information about the Russians actually preparing, you know, to use nuclear weapons. They'd have to take them out of the places they're stored. They'd have to, you know, get ready in a lot of different ways, and they simply haven't moved in that direction. I must say, if you watch Moscow television, they have been completely irresponsible in very casually talking about, you know, nuclear attacks on Europe, you know, hitting Berlin and Paris with nuclear weapons as if this is something that is a real option for any, you know, any responsible leader. And I don't quite know why they think that this is advantageous to tell their own people that they have this kind of option, but it's, you know, it's highly irresponsible. So I'd like to say a little bit about the external conditions and external reactions to the war. I think that everybody in the first month or two of the war was extremely surprised and gratified by the unity that was expressed in NATO, particularly on the part of the Germans, which, you know, under Chancellor Scholz, you know, gave up 40 years of Ostpolitik and said that they were going to double the size of their defense budget. And although it happened very slowly, you know, they've begun to permit the shipment of weapons to Ukraine and the like. But I do think that we are at a rather perilous moment in that alliance unity. As long as Ukraine seemed to be making military advances on the ground, you know, first in the area around Kyiv, where they drove the Russians out of their positions, and, you know, the whole Russian effort to take the capital and bring about a collapse of the regime failed, you know, quite miserably, and then went on to push the Russians back from the area around Kharkiv and to secure that city. I think that there was a hope that that momentum would be kept up. But now that the war has moved to this, as you said, Valerii, this very narrow salient around Severodonetsk, where the progress has been, you know, it's been slow, but it's been fairly steady on the Russian side. All of a sudden now you're seeing cracks in the alliance attitude towards the war. And so just in the past couple of weeks, you had Henry Kissinger at Davos saying that, you know, there ought to be a negotiated settlement with Ukrainian concessions. The New York Times published an editorial making a similar kind of argument. You had the leaders of France and Germany talking again to Vladimir Putin, who I agree is really a war criminal, about the possibility of reopening grain exports and the like. And I think that the real danger is that the alliance solidarity that has been so remarkable up to this point is going to decline as the war grinds on and as there doesn't look like there's a lot of momentum towards Ukraine actually driving Russia out of the south. That's why I think the new offensive that the Ukrainian military began to try to liberate Kherson and really break that land bridge to Crimea is really critical. From a military standpoint, it makes sense not to make a last stand in Severodonetsk and actually to try to make new gains further south. But I do worry about the unity of the alliance if there isn't a counteroffensive. And I think the next few weeks are going to be really critical because both sides have suffered pretty terrible losses. In that respect, I think there's some room for optimism because Russia seems to be running out of everything. They're running out of men. That's probably the first problem that they've got. They simply don't have the forces. They've decided not to go for a general mobilization, and they've lost a terrible number of people, casualties. They've also had tremendous equipment losses. They're having to bring these old T-62s out of storage because so many of their modern tanks have been destroyed up to this point, whereas Ukraine is now getting supplies from the United States, from other NATO allies of much longer missile systems and anti-ship missiles and a lot of other equipment. I hope that Ukrainian forces can train on this equipment rapidly, learn to use it, incorporate it into their existing inventories, and then really use this to break that that Russian hold in the south. And I think that I would say that the real diplomatic future is going to depend on the degree to which Ukraine can establish some forward momentum on the ground, and then that will then calm some of these jitters that are existing in NATO capitals. But I wonder if you agree with that assessment.
Yes, sir. First of all, I would like to say that the major diplomatic arena now is the battlefield around Severodonetsk, where diplomatic affairs are being made by Ukrainian armed forces. That means that a real success of Ukrainian armed forces changes the situation and creates the room for diplomacy. Because as far as we know, that Putin for the moment isn't ready for any negotiations, and he would be ready for negotiations only in that case when his army will really lose. What I'm afraid is something that we can call Ukrainian fatigue, because the war has moved into territories with the long names complicated for American pronunciations, European pronunciations, like Severodonetsk, and far from Kiev, and it looks like the war could not be kept on the first pages and on the major TV news for a very long time. Today is the day number 100 since the invasion. It's today, and for us, subjectively in Ukraine, this is like a year or maybe even longer. And what we are afraid is the fatigue of all these news and so on and so on. Concerning international politics, indeed, we see absolutely tectonic changes during weeks, which we believed could be made only in decades, like changes in policy of Germany, which we mentioned, or fantastic unity of NATO and European Union and the West in general. But many politicians would like to keep status quo. This is not only about Europeans, it is also about Chinese. So to let everything go back to the January 1st, let's say, of this year, which could not be achieved. So the world has changed dramatically, and now we should think about the future, not only about current war, but how to make conclusions from and how to learn lessons from everything which we saw during these 100 days, and how to change the world, including military policies over different nations, including international organizations, and so on, to ensure global security. And I would like to ask you, sir, about lessons which the world, which international community should learn from this war. What do you think, sir?
Well, I've just written a new book called Liberalism and Its Discontents, which is an effort to explain what liberalism is and why it still remains the most important ideology or political structure that needs to be defended around the world. You know, liberalism is a doctrine that says that all human beings are basically morally equal, that they have rights, rights to speech, to belief, to association, that they should be free to make decisions in their lives, and that this needs to be protected by a rule of law in which the power of governments are limited, and there are checks and balances against dictatorship and excesses by presidents or prime ministers or leaders, elites in the society. And this is really, I think, what's at stake in this war. In 2019, Putin gave a very famous interview to the Financial Times in which he said that liberalism is an obsolete doctrine. And in this, he's been supported by many populist leaders around the world. You know, people like Marine Le Pen or Eric Zemmour in France, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Donald Trump in the United States, who has never been able to say a negative thing about him. And I think that that's really the larger stake that is that we're fighting over. I think that in some respects, it's been a good thing that people can see what the alternative to liberalism is. Putin is the alternative. If you say, why does Donald Trump admire Putin? It's because he's not a liberal. He doesn't accept the need for constraints on his power. Trump has been trying to overturn the last election that he lost pretty clearly and decisively, yet he doesn't want that whole structure of media and courts that tell him he lost. He would like to disregard those checks and balances. And I think that he's preparing to make a comeback in 2024, at which point he'll be able to do the things that he couldn't do in 2020, like withdraw from NATO, switch support from Ukraine to Russia, and this sort of thing. So I think that the world is still, in a lot of peril right now. I think that the outcome of this war in Ukraine is going to have a major impact on the rest of the world, one way or the other. And if Putin succeeds in grabbing a major part of Ukraine and holding on to it, he's going to be able to say that, forget about the earlier objectives of overthrowing the regime altogether. We've managed to secure the Donbass, and we're able to choke Ukraine economically, and he'll be able to portray that as a kind of victory, and that will then vindicate a lot of populists that supported him, despite all of the genuine genocide and human rights violations and deporting of populations that has occurred under Putin's occupation. I'm afraid that those populists will regain some traction. So that's why I think that the war has a much larger implication for the global liberal order, and that's why it's really important that other liberal democracies around the world continue to give Ukraine the maximum amount of support that they can. As an American, I'm actually quite worried about the future of my country, because I do think that we haven't defeated this populist movement. In some ways, it's gotten stronger over the past year because the Republican Party has not abandoned, this narrative about a stolen election and so forth. And so we have a lot of work to do at home in order to shore up our own liberal institutions and make sure that we can continue to support other liberal democracies in other parts of the world.
You mentioned Donald Trump. Do you think that this gentleman could be elected as president of the United States again?
Oh, it's certainly possible. There are a number of reasons for that. I mean, the most troubling are the fact that, there's a lot of Republicans at a state level in the United States that are actually trying to put officials in place that would be willing to overturn a future election. This didn't happen in states like Arizona and Georgia last time around because you had enough Republicans that had the principles and conviction, to actually follow the rules, the constitutional rules, and so they didn't get overturned. But there's an effort to replace them with people that are much more pliable, and that's a big danger if there's a close election in 2024. The other problem is that the Democrats, I think, have had a hard time positioning themselves as viable alternatives, and I think there's a kind of definite lack of enthusiasm, for their leadership and so forth. It's too bad. I think that President Biden has actually done a pretty good job in, handling this crisis caused by the Russian invasion, but in terms of his popularity, it hasn't really registered. He hasn't gotten very much support for his handling of this, and that means that we're still vulnerable to a return of the Republicans and real, I think, serious threats to our own liberal democratic system in the United States.
Thank you, Professor. Coming back to Ukraine, we are now fighting, but we are now starting to discuss the outlines, sketch of Ukrainian rebuilding, reconstruction, let's say. And what we understand is that we have three tasks which are, let's say, controversial in certain sense, which is rebuilding, building back all destroyed infrastructure, which is European integration, which means getting a candidacy and then maybe full membership one day, and modernization, which means bring the country up to the next level of development. And those three processes will be parallel and will be controversial. So rebuilding needs fast and cheap solutions, just to ensure that there are no homeless people and so on. And modernization needs complicated and long-term solutions, and European integration needs very sustainable solutions, and so on. So we indeed, we could, let's say, provide all homeless people with, let's say, paper boxes, and there will be no homeless people anymore. This is a very fast and cheap solution. and this is not a sustainable solution, and this is not a European solution indeed. So how to this is something like a strategic triangle. So we can reach two of them and not three. So how do you see priorities and how to combine faster reconstruction with the wise modernization, which we need as well?
Well, it's going to be a very complicated process because most of the resources for that reconstruction are going to have to come from outside Ukraine. I think that the U.S. Congress has already passed a pretty large aid package that includes money for that sort of thing, but the real resources are going to have to be much larger if the war ends, hopefully, on good terms for Ukraine. My feeling has always been that the physical and economic reconstruction are obviously important, but there needs to be a political reconstruction that gets at some of the problems in the Ukrainian political economic system that existed prior to the war. For example, I would say that the biggest problem Ukraine faced before February 24th was the domination of both the economy and Ukrainian politics by a handful of oligarchs who, each controlled a radio, TV station, newspapers, and could control the flow of information in their own interest. A lot of those oligarchs have had their properties destroyed, so Mr. Akhmetov's, he was the owner of the Azovstal plant that has now been reduced to rubble. And I think that, one of the things that needs to be done is to make sure that their domination of both politics and the economy, doesn't come back or doesn't recur. In thinking about this, it seems to me that there are a couple of precedents for how to handle this problem. In 1945, after Germany and Japan were defeated, these were two countries that had a similar economic structure, that both countries had these large conglomerates that dominated the economy and were used by the fascist regimes, to manipulate to their advantage the economic life of both countries. And the United States and the other occupation authorities made a big effort to try to dismantle those conglomerates and make sure that they didn't exercise the power that they did prior to the war. And I think, something like that is important in Ukraine's case. I know that a lot of people in Ukraine have been thinking about this already. But if you don't have a change in the political structure, it's going to be hard to really revive the economy without returning to some of the older problems that faced Ukraine. So that, I would say, is certainly, as far as I'm concerned, would be one of the priorities for the country as it thinks to recovery.
Thank you, Professor. I agree that we have a big homework in Ukraine to do. I'm speaking to many people, to hundreds of people now. Some of them are serving now in the armed forces. Some of them are so-called volunteers. This word in Ukraine means, let's say, hundreds of thousands of people who supply the army and assist displaced persons and provide rescue and so on. So that's do everything which the state institutions were unable to do. And some of them are entrepreneurs and so on. And the greatest fear of Ukrainians is now not a defeat. So Ukrainians are not afraid of defeat, but they are afraid of losing a chance. Because indeed the war is suffering, destruction, blood and death. But at the same time, it brings a chance to change the everyday rules of the game to the better, because the war always highlights all better values and virtues, let's say, of people. And also I here refer to your book Identity, where you consider this issue in details. And let's speak a little bit about Russia, because this is important for the whole world. So what will be with Russia? My feeling is, I'm not an expert on Russia indeed, but I explore Russia last 3 months, 12 hours per day, to understand what can we do. And I'm a member of those forces who tried to deliver truth to Russian people. And we can say that indeed Russian people has access to the truth. This is a choice of millions to believe to Russian television, not to, let's say, European television and so on. So we see that there are so many people which are against the war and which cannot say a word. People could be arrested just for being on the streets with empty sheets of paper, or just saying the word war, which is prohibited in Russia and so on. But indeed, the general population, the majority of population supports Putin. And as Russian sociologists used to say, Putin is a response to every pollster question. So whatever pollsters on the street ask concerning not only the war, not only international affairs, but maybe something like human rights, gender equality, whatever, the answer should be the same. We believe in Putin and we support Putin. So something like 70% of Russians support the war and support expanding the war to Poland and other countries and so on. But what will be with Russia after that? After all military defeat, after pressure of sanctions, should Russia collapse, which many people in America are afraid? Should Russia be transformed into democracy? What is your vision, sir?
Well, unfortunately, what my vision is doesn't really matter. I think that, Russia is going to be resistant to change. The only possible source of change is from within the security elites around Putin. And, although there are many rumors at this point about people being unhappy, it's really not clear that that's going to have any effect. And so I'm afraid that we're all just going to have to wait and, see how the war on the ground plays out. I do think that will have an effect on how those elites regard Putin. But for the moment, I'm not expecting any, major domestic upheavals there. And I don't think that it's safe to make policy based on, the expectation that that will happen.
Well, in this case, I will dare to make a prediction. As far as we know, in Russia, in every form in Russia, empire, in Soviet empire and so on, there are only two ways of either strengthening of central power or weakening of central power. In the first case, we see something like Stalinism, fascism, or Putinism. And in second way, we see something like Gorbachev, who a lovely person in the West who stopped the Cold War and removed the threat of nuclear war, which was real that time, not like now. And so my prediction is that Russia will collapse, and this because of the absolute majority of Russian regions, they live on donations from the federal center. And Russia indeed is not a federation anymore. This is the word federation is just a part of the name, but not a part of the real political practice. There are so many national republics, there are 21 national republics, where some 19%, at least 19% of Russian population are not Russians. And I think even twice more, because people in census say they are Russians to avoid oppression and to avoid losing human rights. And there are some regions like Siberia and so on, which also think about identity. This is again about identity. This is again about all those notions which you describe in details in your book, Identity. And indeed, this collapse of Russia brings so high risks to Ukraine, to Europe, and to America, and to other countries. So I think that we should make this, since this collapse is inevitable, we should make this collapse controlled. controlled by international community, which could save people, save human rights, save Russian cities from civil war, which will begin in Russia. So we should care about future Russia, because otherwise this will be a higher risk to the whole global security if, for instance, nuclear weapon will be taken by by dozens of persons who don't know, or something like this. Or maybe China will be extremely powerful after taking a half of Russia, or a bigger half of Russia, maybe a better half of Russia, and so on. So I'm sure that collapse is inevitable, and we should make this process controlled to ensure that new states which will appear there will be democratic states, at least partially, and there will be no nuclear threat to the whole world. I see Olga here. That means that we should come into a
And I
closing.
have a bunch of questions. I really have a lot. I'll try to group them into different parts. And first, a lot of people are wondering, what internal processes do you think the Russian society should undergo after their defeat in this war? Do you think this should be a similar processes like the Germans after the Second World War, as it's obvious that it's not a war of Russians against Ukraine, not just Putin's, like many want to depict it. So basically that's a question to both of you.
Well, I think that the analogy of Germany after World War II is not a good one, because Germany, was bombed to rubble. It was occupied by 4 different powers, and the defeat was total. I think the danger is that the analogy is going to be Germany after World War I, where it was defeated, but it was still a sovereign country. It wasn't occupied, and there were all of these conspiracy theories about how Germany had been stabbed in the back by traitors, and that really paved the way for the rise of Hitler and Nazism, within another decade. And I'm afraid that, that may be the scenario that plays out in Russia if they are forced to retreat. They won't say, well, I guess that was a really big mistake we made. We need a different kind of system. They'll say, how in the world did this happen to us? It must have been because of traitors within our ranks, or, foreign conspiracies. I think that that's, likely to be the more likely outcome. And that means that outsiders are not going to have very much influence over what happens, inside Russia.
I absolutely agree with Professor Fukuyama, and indeed, this is not a good example, since nobody can and wants to occupy Russia. It isn't possible. So this Russian destiny is in Russian hands, indeed. That means that we should find new leaders and support new leaders and help them to save Russian people and all those small nations which suffer from oppression in Russian Empire. This is still an empire, so decolonization is not finished. It was not finished in 1991. And simply military defeat of Russian forces when the last Russian soldier will leave Ukrainian territory is not a victory, because Putin still will be in Kremlin, and nuclear weapon still will be in his hands. So this is similar to First and Second Chechen War, when Russian forces were defeated in Chechnya and signed an agreement about defeat, let's say something like a capitulation or peace agreement. The whole Russian nation felt resentment, wants revenge, and that revenge came in the form of Second Chechen War, when Chechnya was simply transformed into scorched earth. And this is what we in Ukraine are afraid, the second invasion within, let's say, 4 or 5 years. So we should transform Russia into a country which doesn't threat neither to Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or Estonia or Poland or Lithuania or any European nation or America, indeed. But to do this, we should support those people in Russia who are against the war who are against Putin, and who are for democracy and liberalism. And we should make a difference between passive Russians who say they are good Russians, but what can we do? And those brave Russians who would like to stop the war. We shouldn't mix these two categories. So, Professor?
Well, actually, I need to leave for another meeting shortly. Olga has disappeared, so I'm not quite sure how to bring the session as a whole to a close, but I do think we've had a pretty good discussion of all of the major issues, and I really appreciate the opportunity to, to speak to this audience.
For me, it was a great pleasure and honor, as far as I'm a student and editor of Ukrainian publications of your books. So that's a great honor to be your partner this evening and to deliver a message from Ukraine, from Kyiv to this audience. And since our time is over, maybe we should just thank to everybody who were listening to us, and again express gratitude and appreciation to all those nations, and first of all to American people and the American government for permanent and strong support of Ukraine. We should fight, we should not defeat, we should overcome, and we should prove that values, virtues are important, that democracy is important, that human rights are important, and we understand that we are fighting not only for Ukraine, we are fighting for that, for these principles.
Okay, very
foundational.
good.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
And for all the important insights. I believe most of all need more time to process some thoughts delivered there, especially about the impact on the rest of the world, about different scenarios and development, the global implications and worries about the future and role of actions in it. And special thanks to both of you for touching the economic context. We had a lot of questions about that. We have a lot of homework to do on the lessons learned. And this is why what our conversations are about, to try to find the answer to the questions. What can I do today? And today I would say, do your homework, historical, cultural, economic, think, analyze, and keep looking forward, because the future today is built in Ukraine. We are grateful to our great speakers. We are grateful to our partners for their help. The project is implemented with the support of the US Embassy in Ukraine and our traditional partners. Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, the Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We are streaming today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. And gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand at the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. Pan International is proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. We hope those dialogues give you enough insights and material for deep thinking. Do you want to say anything to close your perspective, Valerii?
I just would like again to appreciate to all those people who support Ukraine, freedom and democracy. We used to say in Ukraine, freedom is our religion. Indeed, we feel ourselves on the edge, on the frontier, on the cutting edge of today's values of Western civilization, and I'm sure we have a lot of homework here.
Yeah,
That's so true. Thank you again, and thank you our speakers, thank you our viewers. Watch the new episode on June 16, 6 p.m. Kyiv time, 4 p.m. London time. Our next guests are Mykola Rybchuk, our great essayist and intellectual, and Sergei Yukelchuk, Canadian historian and expert on USSR and national relationship. The next episode will be held following weeks. Follow our dialogues on war, spread the word, and stand with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.